talk about media mix models. I really want to title this Media Mix Models for the Rest of Us, because you don't necessarily need crazy data infrastructure to execute media mix models, and I'll talk about some of that. Let's go. I'm trying to, sorry. Here we go. All right, this is a bit about me. I'm the founder of RocketShip HQ. We're a boutique growth marketing agency. I also host a mobile user acquisition show. Please check that out. We've got a lot of stuff about measurement creators, all things user acquisition. Definitely recommend checking that out. And I'm here because we've done increasing amounts of work with subscription apps. We've had the number of subscription apps grow post-ATT. A lot of it uses the media mix models that I'm going to talk about today. Right, this is what we're going to cover today. First up, the big measurement mess. And I get into that. How many of you, if I have to take a pop quiz, how many of you are really happy with how your measurement is going on iOS just now? Nobody. How exciting. Yeah, right? That's the big measurement mess. Scan is a nightmare. Some folks we work with see this. Cost per purchase, 630, 1,000, 2,000, what have you. Right? Clearly doesn't make sense. The better, some of the folks who have a lot of signal on day 0, 24 hours, see something like this. It's 40, 50. It's still way above their pre-ATT numbers. The numbers just don't make sense, what you're doing on scan. Right? What's even worse is scan is only one part of the picture. You have Google that uses Firebase, Facebook, TikTok that use scan, AdNetwork's using probabilistic, Apple using Apple Ad Services. So if you look at the CPA here, this is like actual metrics. I've anonymized the app itself. But if you see the CPA, it says 116, 21, 110. You can't have one source be like 6 times the other, right? And that's what happens because you're just comparing completely different sources. You're just not going to be able to say which one's doing better, which one's doing worse. Right? And this is part of the problem and challenge that I see literally every app marketer facing on iOS lately. So what do you do about this? And this is true irrespective of what scale you're at. Obviously, if you're on one channel, you can just use Facebook and be done with it. But the moment you get 2 or even 3 channels, this is a problem. So what do you do about this? Right? So media mix models, it's one of the most important things we do to make sense of the mess we are all in just now. What's a media mix model? This is what the Harvard Business Review says it is. Right? It says, oh, you have X amount of revenue. You have all of these market conditions, marketing actions. We're going to find out which of these contributes to your revenue. Easy, right? So this could be like, oh, you have gas prices, days of the week, month of the year. Is it raining? What is the consumer confidence? Facebook ads, GSP. Now, how many of you track consumer confidence or gas prices? Right? I don't. Well, the good news is if you're a mobile app, you don't need to track a lot of these things because especially if you're a subscription app, the big conversion signal happens within 24 hours, which in nearly every subscription app is the free trial, happens within 24 hours. Doesn't matter, unless, if you're like a weather app, maybe you want to look at the rain. If you're like a gas prices app, if you're like a traffic app, you want to look at gas prices. But for the vast majority of apps, you don't need to worry about a lot of these variables. A lot of what you need to build a basic media mix model is with your MMP, with your apps, with your spend sources, with your ad platforms. So it's a lot easier to do than if you were Nike or Coca-Cola, where you would actually have to look at gas prices and consumer confidence and what have you. Right? So I'm going to talk about the easiest DIY implementation. And I think it was Sunil who said in the last panel, which that the sophistication of your mix goes up with the spend. Right? This is a DIY implementation. You can make this as sophisticated as you want, but at the bare minimum, this is something we do recommend. You can also do a spreadsheet-based model, but this is the bare minimum we recommend and we implement, and I hope you guys can implement for yourself. Even if you don't know coding, right? So I am a failed engineer. You don't need to know code. You need to know how to copy and paste code. That's all you need to know. So here's what Robin includes. You need to identify dependent variables, right, which are the variables you can control. For a subscription app, that would be, dependent variables are the outcomes, which could be revenue or trials. I typically recommend trials because that is directly influenced by your marketing spend. If you take total revenue, that oftentimes includes renewal revenue. And typically, that's not necessarily a direct influence of immediate marketing. So as your V1, I almost always recommend taking trials as a conversion. Take the holidays and seasonality is already factored into the model that's already there, but you can modify it if you want, depending on the geos. The other important piece is the independent variables. Right, so I have some links at the end, so you can actually download a lot of this code. We also have walkthroughs, so you can basically run this code for yourself. But these are the important pieces. You need to take spend of each of your sources. And as you can see, we've split ASA into brand and non-brand, because obviously if you combine those, your picture looks very, very different. And you can also use impressions instead of installs if you want. Right? So basically you say, what are your inputs, which are spends, and installs or impressions? What are your outputs, which are trials, revenue, and so on and so forth? For Robin, all you need is like a CSV. The code you run picks up your raw data from your CSV. You say, hey, here are your trials. Here's your spends across all of your platforms. Here are your installs across all of your platforms. Everything to the right are your input variables. The trials are your outputs. Of course, if you feel revenue or purchases are more meaningful, you can do that. But generally, like I said, trials happen first 24 hours, use trials. Once you run the code, right, and again, running the code, you need to modify the code, you need to run the code. There are walkthroughs and tutorials at the end, which you can do yourself. Once you do, you will get a folder with your output files. You get multiple models that you can pick from. This is the coolest thing about the output that you get from Robin, which is you get to see what is the impact of each channel, right? So you say, what is the share of spend and what is the share of effect? I've anonymized some of the channels here because they're somewhat app specific, but you say, look, for instance, Google here spent, Google's effect share was 11.9, which means Google drove 11.9% of trials, but its spend was only 10.7. Right? So there's a little bit of an imbalance. In an ideal world, the share of effect and share of spend would be exactly similar, but that's not the case. So you see where there is an imbalance, right? And this becomes especially important when you see Scan giving you completely nonsensical numbers. You get $600, $700 CPA, so you just can't compare that. So you need this to level set what's the actual share of effect of each of your channels. Right? The other key output you get is what's your ideal versus ideal share of budgets. Right? So you say, look, this is your current share of budget on Facebook. It's 58%, but it's actually your ideal share of budget should be 53. On Google, it's 37. It should ideally be 42. So if you're way over-indexing on certain channels, this helps you level set and understand what is actually performing well, what is not doing well when Scan is such a huge mess, right? When you can't compare Scan metrics at all, right? So these are the two big pieces of output you get, and like you saw, there's just a lot of other pieces of data in that folder, but the 80-20 of this is these two charts that you want to look at, right? Now, obviously, here you looked at a lot of past spend and install data. You looked at past revenue. It's still a model, right? Like every model, there are going to be errors. How do you make sure your MMM is as error-free as can be, or it's actually useful and meaningful? Because if your model's inaccurate, if your data is inaccurate, you're just going to get junk results, and you don't want to be running that, right? So number one is backtest your model. So look at your actual versus predicted response. So in this case, you say, if you see before Jan 2022, there's a lot of deviation between the blue line and the orange line, right? So you want to exclude that for the purposes of the model because the model is not doing a good job of predicting what your actual revenue is, right? But after Jan 22, it's mostly they are in sync, but there are still some days when there's a big orange spike, but there is no blue spike. So you want to manually exclude some of those. You also want to be looking at the R-squared, which is a measure of accuracy. Generally, again, at low levels of spends, I try to get to at least 0.90. In an ideal world, you want to be 95 to 99% plus, but for low levels of spend, you want to be at least 0.90. If you're not there, you want to go back to your model. You want to relook at your model and tweak things around. Right? The other things to note, obviously, you want to have enough critical mass of data. Generally, I recommend at the very least 2,500 per day for minimum 2 months. 100K per month is even better. 400, 500K, you get very strong, solid data. With 2,500, you will want to play around with the models to make sure your accuracy is strong enough, right? And obviously, you want to make sure your variables are from a single geo. Oftentimes, if you just take worldwide, your data is going to be much more messy, which unfortunately also means if you're running a single, if you're running multiple geos and you want to see, hey, how is my performance in Belgium doing? It's probably not the best technique for you, right? And you also want to ensure your independent variables are not too granular. So you're like, hey, I added this new creative today. How is it doing? No, you're not going to get answers to that. But if your creative level spend is $10 a day, $20 a day, this gives you answers about big changes you're making, and also take variables that are meaningfully impacted by spend. Like I said, just take trials. For all subscription apps, I recommend taking trials because, again, that's directly influenced by your marketing spend. So these are some of the ways you make sure you're not getting garbage in, garbage out. Because oftentimes we've just taken models. We've seen just bad accuracy from the models, and that's just because we haven't followed some of these practices. We've taken either total revenue, or we've taken like all geos, and in those cases, you're just not going to get enough accuracy for your models. And how do you report, right? So you run these models, which is all fancy and great. How does this fit into your day-to-day operations? What we do is we typically report on costs and CPA as reported by SKAN, and for Google we report Firebase. Apple is reported by search ads. TikTok and Facebook are by SKAN. We use CPA SKAN, but we also report CPA Robin side by side. We use a multiplier, which again assumes a somewhat linear correlation. Not always true, but again, it's a good rule of thumb if you're starting off with not a lot of resources. But use that multiplier, and we report on CPA Robin every time. Right? This is something we definitely recommend, and we do for most of our key engagements. We run models typically once a month, and we review and revise what the Robin output looks like. We review and revise the multipliers so we can see what the actual performance looks like, have things changed in the month. And during the intra-month period, we use the multiplier to calculate your CPA Robin. Right? That's typically how we recommend reporting. And obviously, as you can see, this doesn't include campaign-level data or creative-level data. If your campaigns have enough spend, you can break that down. Or if your creator has enough spend, you can break that down. But otherwise, I would just say stick to the channel level. Right? And these could be some of the results you see. Right? This is something we did. This part of a report we sent out. But we noticed that Firebase reported amazing performance for Google. But the MMM said Google is just not contributing to the overall share of effect. We cut down Google's spend, and our overall spends went down by 35%. No change in trials. Everything was just uniform, which was like, oh my God, we had been throwing away a lot of this money because Google said your performance is great. Don't believe them. Google is the referee and the player. Never trust a platform. Yeah. never trust a platform, right? Verify independently. And with MMM, you can use aggregated data to independently verify what SKAN is saying, what Google is saying, and come to your own, verdict on how things are performing, right? Yeah, and here's some optional homework if you'd like. Search on YouTube for mobile user acquisition show, Facebook Robin. You should find these links. And these walk you through how you can run the code for yourself. Like I said, I'm not a programmer. I'm a failed engineer. I was able to get this up and running with the help of an external consultant. He helped me, but all you need to do is to be able to copy-paste code and customize a lot of your raw data. This is very, very DIY. This is very doable, even if you have very minimal resources. So I highly recommend this if you're doing any kind of meaningful acquisition spend, right? So I'll leave you with this thought, which is all models are wrong. Some models are useful. Take that with a pinch of salt. And yeah, I hope this helps you make some more sense of all of the mess that's happening with iOS and with your measurements, right? And if you want to stay in touch, please hit me up at any point of time to talk user acquisition, measurement. Check out our podcast, Mobile User Acquisition Show. There's a lot about it. And hit me up, hi@rocketshiphq.com. The other shout out is Mobile Growth Lab, which goes into, that's our workshop series, which goes into a lot of this in a lot more detail, right? And I will leave you with all of this. Thank you so much for your time.